long before the Romans arrived with their roads and their eagles, long before the Normans crossed the Channel with their war horses and their ambitions, long before anyone whose name appears in a textbook ever set foot on this particular cluster of islands, people were already here, building, thinking, leaving things behind, and most of what they left behind we still do not understand. This is a journey through the deep layers of British history, not the history you were taught in school, not the kings and queens and battles, but the older story, the one written in stone circles and buried chambers and ancient trackways that have been walked for so long they have pressed themselves permanently into the earth. We are going to go back, much further back than most histories dare to go, to a time when the land itself was different, when the sea had not yet swallowed the connections between Britain and the continent, when people lived and built and worshipped in ways we are only beginning to understand. Breathe slowly, let the day go quiet around you. There is nowhere you need to be tonight, only here, in the long, slow river of time. We begin at the beginning, before Britain was an island. Imagine standing on dry land, where the southern North Sea now rolls. Imagine forests, meadows, rivers, winding through valleys that no longer exist. Imagine the smell of wood smoke, and the sound of water, and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of human life being lived somewhere that is now 40 meters beneath the waves. This place had a name, though we only gave it that name recently. We call it Dogland. Between approximately 12,000 and 6,000 years before the present, the area that now lies under the North Sea was inhabitable land. It connected Britain to what is now Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium. It was not a narrow land bridge, it was a substantial territory, a homeland for thousands of people over many thousands of years. We know this because the sea gives things back. Fishermen working the southern North Sea have been hauling up strange artifacts for well over a century. Bones of woolly mammoths, antlers of giant deer, the skulls of our rocks, those magnificent, wild cattle that stood 6 feet at the shoulder and whose horns spanned wider than a man's outstretched arms. Stone tools, worked pieces of bone and antler that show the unmistakable marks of human hands. In 1931, a fishing trawler working in the Lehman and Owanks area brought up a solid lump of peat in its nets. Inside the peat was a barbed spear point made from antler bone. It was beautifully made, precisely shaped, the kind of object that requires skill, practice, and intention to produce. The kind of object that belongs to a person, not just to a species. Someone made that spear point, someone held it, someone used it perhaps to hunt the aurochs, or the red deer, or the wild horses that grazed those now vanished plains. And then the water came. The end of Dogland was not a single dramatic event. It was a process measured in centuries and millennia as the glaciers of the last ice age melted, and the seas slowly, inexorably rose. Generation after generation, the land shrank. In coastlines that grandparents remembered would be salt marsh by the time grandchildren were born. What had been meadow became esty. What had been esty became open sea. But there was one final catastrophic moment. Around 8,000 years ago, a massive underwater landslide occurred off the coast of what is now Norway. The Store Slide, as geologists call it, displaced an enormous volume of water and sent a tsunami rolling across the North Sea basin. The wave, when it reached the remaining low-lying portions of Dogland, would have been devastating. Some researchers believe it effectively ended Dogland as a place of continuous human habitation. The survivors, those who were on higher ground, those who were fortunate in ways they could never have understood, found themselves on a new coastline. Ever the familiar paths to the south and east now ended in water. Britain, though no one yet called it that, had become an island, but people were already here, had been here, in fact, for a very long time. The oldest Britons. Before we go forward, we need to go back even further, because the story of human life in Britain does not begin with the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who witnessed the drowning of Dogland. It begins far earlier, in fits, and starts with people who came and went, as the climate allowed. In a cave in the Yorkshire Dales, called Victoria Cave, a bone harpoon was found alongside the bones of extinct animals. In Kent's Cavern, near Torquay and Devon, fragments of human jaw have been dated to somewhere between 40,000 and 44,000 years ago, making them among the oldest known human remains in Britain. But even those are relative newcomers compared to the evidence from Happisburgh in Norfolk. Happisburgh, pronounced Hasbor by those who grew up near it, is a village on the Norfolk coast that is slowly being eaten by the sea. The cliffs there are soft, and every winter storm takes another few meters of land, which means that ancient layers are constantly being exposed, constantly being revealed for a brief moment before they too are swept away. In 2013, after a particularly dramatic storm, a team of archaeologists surveying the newly exposed beach found something extraordinary. In the freshly uncovered sediment, preserved in ancient Estine mud, were footprints, human footprints. A group of at least 5 individuals, adults and children, walking across a mudflat beside an ancient river Este. The footprints were dated to approximately 900,000 years ago. 900,000 years. Think about that number for a moment in the quiet space before sleep. Think about the depth of it. The human species, as we understand it, Homo sapiens, has only existed for around 300,000 years. These footprints were made by people who belonged to an earlier form of humanity, possibly Homo antecessor, a species now entirely extinct. They were walking together, adults and children, on a grey Estine flat, beside a wide, slow river. Perhaps they were heading somewhere specific, perhaps they were following game, perhaps they were simply doing what people do, moving through the landscape that sustained them. Within 2 weeks of their discovery, those footprints were gone, erased by the tide. We have only photographs and measurements, but for a brief moment, the sea gave back something almost impossibly precious. 900,000 years of human presence on this land. We are not the first to build here. We are not even close. The return after the ice, the last great glaciation, the period when ice sheets covered much of northern Europe and pushed human populations south, ended approximately 11 to 12,000 years ago. As the ice retreated, the land was left changed, scraped and scoured, littered with glacial debris, but also renewed. New soils forming, new river systems cutting their way to new coastlines, and slowly, tentatively, life returning. Plants first, then animals following the plants, then people following the animals. The people who came back to Britain after the ice were hunter-gatherers. Mobile communities, typically small, ate moving through a landscape they understood with extraordinary intimacy. They knew where the salmon ran in spring. They knew which hillsides held the best flint for tool-making. They knew the paths the red deer took between their summer and winter grazing grounds. They did not, as far as we can tell, build permanent structures. Their architecture was light, temporary, designed to be assembled and disassembled, shelters of wood and hide, hearths that would leave only charcoal stains in the earth. The archaeology of these people is by necessity an archaeology of subtle traces, but some traces survive. At a site called Starcar, in the Vale of Pickering in Yorkshire, archaeologists have found evidence of what may be the oldest known house in Britain. A circular structure, about 3.5 meters across, has built around 11,000 years ago. Its walls are gone, but the post holes that held them remain. Cut into the old lake sediment, filled now with darker soil that betrays their location to a careful eye. Starcar has given us much more than a house. It has given us one of the most remarkable assemblages of Neolithic artifacts ever discovered anywhere in Europe. Barbed bone and antler points, stone tools of extraordinary refinement, and most famously, a collection of red deer skulls with antlers still attached, carefully modified to be worn as headdresses. Why the headdresses? We cannot know for certain, but their careful construction suggests ceremony, transformation, the idea of wearing the form of another animal, of temporarily inhabiting its identity. This is a kind of thinking that we recognize. It is spiritual thinking. It is imaginative thinking. These are not merely people surviving. These are people with inner lives. And as the Mesolithic period progressed, as communities became more established in their seasonal rounds, as knowledge accumulated across generations, and the landscape itself became marked with meaning, something began to shift. The question of why human communities made the transition from mobile hunting and gathering to more settled ways of living is one of the most debated in all of archaeology. In Britain, the shift happened gradually across several thousand years, beginning somewhere around 6,000 years ago. It is associated with a package of changes that archaeologists bundle together under the term past, Jochli, tent. Neolithic, meaning New Stone Age, farming, settled communities, the keeping of domesticated animals, the cultivation of crops, new kinds of pottery, and most visibly to us today, a whole new tradition of building in stone. The first stone builders. There is a moment, standing in front of a Neolithic tomb, when you stop trying to explain it, and simply receive it. These structures are old in a way that defies ordinary comprehension. The oldest long barrows in Britain were constructed around 5,500 years ago. They predate the Egyptian pyramids. They predate Stonehenge. They predate writing. They predate by a significant margin every civilization whose name you learned in school. And yet there they are, still standing, still precisely oriented, still enclosing their chambers of arranged stone, still holding within them the memory of the people who built them and the people who were placed within them. The long barrow tradition in Britain represents one of the first architectural traditions on these islands. Long, low mounds of earth, typically oriented roughly east-west, with stone-lined chambers at their eastern ends or running through their lengths. They are found across Britain, particularly in the west and north from the chalk downlands of Wessex to the windswept islands of Orne. They are without question monuments to the dead. But to reduce them to merely that is to miss something important. These were not simply places to put bodies. They were places where the boundary between living and dead was managed, negotiated, maintained. When archaeologists excavate the chambers of long barrows, they often find bones in disarray, not in neat rows, not laid out as you might expect for simple burial, but mixed together, sorted, rearranged skulls, separated from the rest of the skeleton and placed in particular positions. Certain bones apparently removed from the tomb and then returned. Bones from multiple individuals commingled in ways that suggest the tombs were entered and re-entered over long periods of time. The dead in Neolithic Britain were not simply deposited and forgotten. They were visited, perhaps consulted, perhaps their bones were carried out during significant events and brought back again. The relationship between the living and the dead was active, ongoing. We sleep now, you and I, in a world where the dead are kept at a careful distance, enclosed in churchyards, behind walls, separated from ordinary daily life. But for thousands of years on this island, the dead were more present. Their bones were in the landscape, accessible, known, nor in the places that held them were among the most important features of the world. Let yourself settle a little deeper now. The day is entirely gone. There is nothing left of it but this quiet Wan's smithy. On the Beeshire Downs, now technically in Oxfordshire, beside one of the oldest roads in Britain, there is a long barrow that has accumulated legend upon legend across the millennia. The road is the Ridgeway. It runs along the chalk ridge of the Downs, and people have been walking it for at least 5,000 years, perhaps longer. It connects, or once connected, a series of prehistoric sites across southern England, and walking it even today, even on a busy summer day, with other walkers ahead and behind, there is a sense of accumulated time, of feet upon feet, in the same direction, ender wearing the same path, deeper into the earth. The barrow beside the Ridgeway is called Wan Smai. The name comes from Anglo-Saxon legend, from the figure of well, and the smith, the divine craftsman of Germanic mythology. The Saxons, arriving in the 5th and 6th centuries after Christ, found this ancient structure, beside the ancient road, and wove it into their own stories. If you left your horse and a silver coin overnight, the legend said, by morning the horse would be shore and the coin gone. But one smithy is far older than any Anglo-Saxon legend. Its two phases of construction date back to somewhere between 3700 and 3400 BCE. The earlier monument was a small rectangular mortuary structure of wood containing the 20-tomlete remains of at least 14 individuals. The later monument, the one still standing, and is a trapezoidal long barrow, roughly 50 meters long, faced with large sarsen stones at its wider eastern end. The chamber at the eastern end is accessible today. You can duck through the entrance between the great standing stones and enter the low, dark space within. When you do, you are entering somewhere that was first sealed more than 5,000 years ago and then reopened many times across the centuries. Archaeologists found scattered, disarticulated bones there. The careful, intentional management of the dead stand inside on a winter evening when the light is low and the wind moves through the beeches that have grown up around the barrow over the past several centuries and try to hear nothing but the wind. Who are you thinking of? The people who built one smithy were farmers. They grew emmer wheat and eson, and they kept cattle and pigs and sheep. They lived in communities that left traces of rectangular timber halls, substantial structures that indicate some permanence of settlement. They made pottery, unpretentious but functional. They traded, at least occasionally, over distances that would surprise you. The sarsen stones used to face one smithy came from a source several miles away across the downs. Moving them required organized labor, required coordination across groups, required perhaps the kind of occasion that would bring people together from across a wide area, the kind of communal effort that itself creates community. The building of a monument is not just construction. It is an act of collective identity, Avery, and the landscape of ceremony. There is a village in Wiltshire that sits inside a stone circle, and not beside one, inside one. Avery is a village of perhaps 500 people, with a pub and a church and a manor house and a village green. It has all the features of an ordinary English village, and surrounding it, passing through it, bisected by the modern road that runs through them. The middle of it is the largest stone circle in the world. The outer circle at Avery has a diameter of roughly 330 meters. Within it are two smaller circles. The whole complex is enclosed by a massive bank and ditch. The ditch cut nearly 10 meters deep into the chalk bedrock. The bank thrown up from the spoil to create a ridge that would have been dramatically white when it new. From inside the ditch, looking up at the bank, the visual impression would have been of enclosure, of being contained within a defined and intentional space. The stones themselves are enormous, not shaped like Stonehenge's carefully worked sass, but rough natural boulders dragged from the downs, some weighing 30 or 40 tons, placed upright in their original form. There is an aesthetic here that seems to emphasize the natural, the found, the brought into place, rather than the manufactured. Avery was constructed over a long period, probably beginning around 2850 BCE, and continuing for several centuries. It was not built all at once. It grew, changed, was modified, and added to by successive generations who inherited it and felt the need to respond to it, to engage with it, to leave their mark upon a place that already carried the marks of their predecessors. But Avery is not an isolated monument. It is the center of a landscape. Running south from Avery for 2.5 kilometers is a ceremonial avenue, the West Kennet Avenue, flanked on both sides by standing stones. The avenue connects Avery to another site, the sanctuary on Overton Hill, where a series of concentric rings of wooden posts once stood, later replaced by stone. The avenue was a processional route, a defined path through the landscape, a way of moving through space that made the movement itself meaningful. Running northwest from Avery is another avenue, the Beckham Avenue. Its stones now mostly gone, but its course established through archaeology. The landscape was structured, purposeful, a network of paths and places that organized the way people moved through and understood their world. And nearby, within sight of Avery, is Silbury Hill. Silbury Hill is the largest prehistoric mound in Europe. It rises nearly 40 meters above the surrounding plain. Its base covers more than 2 hectares. It is made entirely of chalk and soil, built up in stages over a period of perhaps several centuries, around 2400 BCE. No burial has ever been found within it. No obvious religious structure, just the hill itself, massive and mysterious, standing in the valley of the River Kennet, with a presence that seems to demand attention. Why was it built? This is one of archaeology's most persistent questions, and most honest answers is we do not know. We know it was deliberate. We know it required an enormous investment of communal labor, hundreds of thousands of person-hours of digging and carrying and placing. We know it was maintained and added to over time, and we know it was aligned in ways that may have been astronomically significant. But what it meant to the people who built it, what stories they told about it, what purposes it served in their ceremonial or spiritual life, this we can only guess at. Perhaps that is part of its power. Now the mystery is not a failure of our understanding. It is a genuine, irreducible quality of the place. Silbury Hill keeps its secret after 5,000 years. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing about it. The West Kennet Long Barrow, a mile and a half to the southeast of Albury, on a low ridge above the Kennet Valley, is a long barrow that was already ancient when Avery was built. West Kennet Long Barrow dates to around 3600 BCE, making it older than the great stone circles nearby by several centuries. It is one of the longest barrows in Britain, stretching nearly 100 meters from its broad, stone-faced eastern end to its tapered western tail. It has 5 stone-lined burial chambers, 2 on each side of a central passage and 1 at the end. And these chambers were in use for burial for more than a millennium. When it was finally sealed, around 2000 BCE, the entrance was blocked with enormous sars and stones. By then, it had been in use for over 1500 years. Think about that span of time. 1500 years of returning to the same place with the dead. 1500 years of entering the chambers, rearranging the bones, taking some away, adding new ones. The barrow was a living part of a living landscape for a period longer than the span from the birth of Christ to the present day. Inside the chambers, archaeologists found the remains of at least 46 individuals, their bones mixed and sorted, and in some cases clearly selected. Skulls were given particular attention. Long bones were arranged in groups. There was an interest in the bones of the hand, which appeared in disproportionate numbers. Who were these people? Isotope analysis of their teeth and bones tells us something about their diet, about where they grew up. Some of them appear to have been local, others had perhaps come from further away. They were farmers, eating a diet that included both domesticated grain and domesticated animals. They were probably not particularly tall by modern standards. Their lives, involving hard physical labor that left traces on their bones. They were people with communities and histories and relationships. I'm with things they valued and things they feared, with ways of understanding the world that made complete sense within their context and that we can now only approach indirectly through the evidence they left behind. At dusk, the entrance of West Kennet Long Barrow frames the setting sun. This is not accidental. The orientation was deliberate, a part of the monument's meaning, a way of connecting the chambers of the dead to the daily and seasonal movements of the greatest light in the sky. On the morning of the mid-winter solstice, the rising sun shines directly into the passage. The dead kept in their stone chambers through the long dark year were given the light of the longest night's ending. Let yourself sink a little deeper into this quiet. The light at the end of the long dark, the warmth that comes after cold, or you know this feeling. Everyone who has ever lived in a northern latitude has known this feeling. It is perhaps the oldest feeling there is. Stonehenge, the monument that changed. No other prehistoric site in Britain has been studied as intensively as Stonehenge. Thousands of excavations, analyses, surveys, and interpretations, and yet Stonehenge continues to surprise. What most people carry in their minds when they think of Stonehenge is an image of the completed monument at its most elaborate phase. The famous linteled trilithons, those paired uprights with their horizontal capstones arranged in a horseshoe, the outer circle of uprights and lintels, the massive sarsen stones, shaped and fitted with a precision that astonishes engineers even today. But this is only one stage of a monument that was built and rebuilt and modified over a period of nearly 2,000 years. The story of Stonehenge begins around 3000 BCE, when a circular ditch and bank was dug in the chalk at the site. This original monument was perhaps modest by later standards, but it was already significant. Within the ditch, a series of pits were dug, known as the Aubrey holes, after their 17th-century discoverer John Aubrey. And these pits held something remarkable: cremated human remains. Stonehenge began, as so many prehistoric monuments did, as a place for the dead. For several centuries, the monument in its earliest form was primarily a cremation cemetery. Hundreds of individuals were buried there, their bones carefully collected after cremation and placed in the earth within the circular enclosure. The circular form itself, the bank and ditch, defined sacred space, creating an inside and an outside, a place apart from the ordinary landscape. Then around 25,500 BCE, something changed. The Great Sass arrived. The Sassen stones of Stonehenge came from Malra Downs, roughly 25 kilometers to the north. The largest of them weigh around 25 tons. Moving them across that distance, across a landscape without roads or wheeled vehicles, without any power source except human and perhaps animal muscle, represents an organizational achievement that we still struggle to fully comprehend. Recent experimental archaeology has demonstrated that it can be done, that with sufficient numbers of people, with wooden sleds and rollers, with organization and determination, such stones can be moved, retrieved. But it requires many hundreds of people working in coordination. It requires planning across seasons and years. It requires, in short, the kind of social and political structure that can marshal collective effort on a large scale. Why was it worth it? The sars were shaped before they were raised. The uprights were given mortise and tenon joints to lock their lintels in place, a technique borrowed from timber carpentry and applied here to stone. This is remarkable for several reasons. First, it shows a sophisticated level of planning. The stones were shaped with their future connections in mind before they were raised into position. Second, it shows the influence of a carpentry tradition that was being transferred into a permanent medium. These were people who built in wood, and they translated their wooden architecture into stone. But the Sassen stones were not the only stones at Stonehenge. Within the Sassen circle, arranged in various configurations whose precise sequencing is still debated, are the blue stones, smaller, darker, roughly 80 in number, at Stonehenge's most complex phase. These stones came from somewhere quite different. They came from Wales. Specifically, they came predominantly from the Preseli Hills in Pembrokeshire, a distance of roughly 220 kilometers. Some were transported by sea, making use of the Bristol Channel. Some came overland. The journey, however it was accomplished, was extraordinary. These were not local materials. These were stones that were deliberately brought from a great distance. Why? The answer may lie in what the blue stones already were before they came to Stonehenge. It is now understood that some of the blue stones had stood in another monument before being dismantled and transported to Wiltshire. A site called Warne Moor in the Preseli Hills is a dismantled stone circle that appears to date to around 3,400 to 3,200 BCE, predating the construction of Stonehenge's Sassen phase. Some researchers believe that stones from Warra and perhaps from other Welsh monuments were deliberately brought to Stonehenge. If this is correct, then the blue stones carried not just physical mass but memory. They were stones with a history, with associations to a place and perhaps to particular communities or traditions. Bringing them to Stonehenge was not simply an act of quarrying and transport, it was an act of integration, of bringing together the significance of one place into the significance of another. And Stonehenge in this reading was not built in isolation, it was built in relationship, and the alignments matter too. The monument's central axis is oriented to the midsummer sunrise and the mid-winter sunset, two moments in the solar year that have always carried enormous significance in Northern Park latitudes. On midsummer morning, the sun rises exactly over the heelstone, a large unworked sarsen that stands outside the main monument, and the light falls down the axis of the monument into the heart of the structure. People still gather at Stonehenge on midsummer. They have done so in one form or another for around 5,000 years. The sun comes up, the light falls exactly where it always has. Something in the arrangement of those stones still speaks to something in us, something old and not entirely rational, something that responds to the precision of the alignment with a feeling that is not quite wonder and not quite recognition, but something between the two. The people behind the stones. For much of the 20th century, the builders of Stonehenge and Alvary were imagined as something like a homogeneous population, a native British Neolithic people building their monuments in isolation. Then genetics began to complicate the picture considerably. Studies of ancient DNA extracted from the bones of Neolithic people buried across Britain have revealed something startling. The Neolithic farming communities who built the long barrows and the earliest stone monuments in Britain were not the descendants of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who had inhabited the islands before them. They were in genetic terms almost entirely different people. Around 4000 BCE, a wave of farmers arrived in Britain from continental Europe, ultimately descending from agricultural communities that had spread westward from Anatolia over several millennia. These people were physically distinctive, with darker skin and eyes than the later Bronze Age populations. They replaced the Mesolithic hunters almost completely in terms of genetic heritage within a few generations. Then around 2400 BCAE, another dramatic genetic shift occurred. The Beaker people arrived. They are named for a distinctive type of pottery. They used bell-shaped beakers, found across a huge area from the Iberian Peninsula to Central Europe. But the beaker phenomenon was more than a pottery style. It was a package of cultural and genetic material that spread rapidly across Western Europe, in Toul, the late 3rd millennium BCE, and in Britain, the arrival of beaker-associated people was genetically transformative. Within a few generations, the population of Britain had changed dramatically. The farming communities of the earlier Neolithic were largely replaced genetically, speaking by people with ancestry connected to the Pontic-Caspian steppe of Eastern Europe, the same ancestry that introduced the Indo-European language family to much of Europe. These are the people who saw Stonehenge in its completed form. These are the people associated with the round barrows of the early Bronze Age. Those smaller, distinctive burial mounds that appear across the British landscape in their thousands, each typically covering a single burial, sometimes with elaborate grave goods. The transition from Neolithic to Bronze Age in Britain was in part a transition in how the dead were treated, from the collective communal burial of long barrows where individual identity merged with the community of ancestors, to individual burial beneath a personal mound where identity was preserved and marked. This shift probably reflects deeper changes in social structure. The Bronze Age introduced not just metal, but hierarchy. There are Bronze Age burials in Britain whose grave goods include objects of extraordinary richness, gold ornaments, bronze weapons, amber beads from the Baltic, fance beads from the Eastern Mediterranean, These are the possessions of people who were important in ways that required visible, permanent demonstration. The Amesbury archer, discovered near Stonehenge in 2002, is one of the most remarkable Bronze Age burials ever found in Britain. A man in his 40s, buried around 2300 BCE, with an astonishing collection of grave goods: 5 biers, copper knives, gold ornaments, arrowheads, stone braces for an archer's wrist, boar's tusks, and more. Isotope analysis of his teeth revealed that he had grown up somewhere in Central Europe, possibly the Swiss Alps or Germany. He was, in other words, an immigrant, someone who had come to Britain, perhaps drawn by the significance of the ceremonial landscape of Stonehenge and Avery, and who had achieved sufficient status in his adopted homeland to merit one of the most lavish burials of his era. The story of Britain has always been a story of arrivals. Bronze Age Britain, a world more connected than we imagined. For much of the 20th century, prehistory was imagined as fundamentally local in communities, living within a small radius of their birthplace, rarely traveling, rarely in contact with distant cultures. The remains they left behind were interpreted within a framework that assumed isolation. Then archaeology began to look more carefully. The evidence of Bronze Age trade and connection in Britain is frankly astonishing. Amber, from the Baltic coast of what is now Denmark, appeared in Bronze Age graves in southern England. Tin from Cornwall and Devon found its way into bronze tools and weapons across a wide area of northwest Europe. Gold from Ireland circulated through Britain and beyond. Egyptian faience beads, glazed ceramic objects, ultimately connected to craft traditions in Stowns, Bilivit, in Mediterranean, turned up in burial mounds on the English Downs. This was not an isolated world, and this was a world of merchants and sailors and connections across what we now think of as forbidding distances. The sea, which we tend to think of as a barrier, was in the Bronze Age a highway. The coastal and riverine peoples of Britain were maritime in a way that is hard for landlocked imaginations to appreciate. They built substantial watercraft. The Dover Bronze Age boat, discovered in 1992 during excavations for a road improvement scheme, is the most complete example we have. A plank-built vessel, roughly 15 meters long, capable of crossing the channel, dated to around 1550 BCE. But the Dover boat was not unique. Dozens of Bronze Age boats have now been found across Britain and Ireland, preserved in river sediments and coastal peat, each one evidence of a society that moved on water with confidence and purpose. One trade in the Bronze Age was not just about acquiring materials, though it was partly that. It was also about acquiring prestige. Bronze itself was a prestige material in much of the period, not because it was functionally superior in every context to stone, but because it required access to two quite different raw materials, copper and tin, that did not typically occur in the same places. Making bronze required networks. The ability to make bronze, or to acquire bronze objects, demonstrated participation in those networks, and the social power of participation in long-distance exchange should not be underestimated. The Bronze Age chieftains, whose elaborate burials have been found across Britain, were demonstrating, among other things, their connectivity. Their gold work showed connections to Ireland, their amber showed connections to Scandinavia, their fiancé showed connections, however indirect, to the Eastern Mediterranean. They were people who were part of a world. The burial of the Amesbury archer, that man from Central Europe, buried near Stonehenge with his extraordinary collection of goods, tells a similar story. He was a metal worker, possibly a goldsmith, and the tools of his trade were among his grave goods. He had traveled far, he had skills that were valued, and when he died, someone, his community, or his descendants or his clients, marked his passing with a monument that would still be visible 4,000 years later. The Druids, and what we actually know, at this point in any account of prehistoric Britain, there is a temptation to bring in the Druids. They have become the defining image of Celtic spiritual life in the popular imagination. White-robed, bearded, cutting mistletoe, with golden sickles by moonlight, conducting mysterious rites in stone circles. Some clarifications are necessary. The ancient Druids, about whom we have genuine historical evidence, were members of the learned class of Iron Age Celtic societies. They were documented by Greek and Roman writers, most extensively by Julius Caesar, whose account of Guish Druids should be read with appropriate caution, given that he was also in the business of conquering the people he was describing. The Druids of written history were a priestly and scholarly class who served as judges, teachers, and ritual specialists. They kept their knowledge in oral tradition, refusing to commit it to writing, on which is one reason we know so little about the actual content of their beliefs. But here is the crucial point for our purposes. The Druids, as a historical phenomenon, belong to the Iron Age, roughly from about 800 BCE onwards. Stonehenge and Avery and the Long Barrows were built 1,000 to 3,000 years before the Druids existed in any historically documented form. The Victorian and later Romantic association of Druids with Stonehenge was an imaginative act, not a historical one. It tells us a great deal about the 18th and 19th centuries and their need to construct a noble, primeval past for Britain. It tells us much less about what actually happened at Stonehenge in the 3rd millennium BCE, and yet the question of who the Celtic peoples of Iron Age Britain were, and what they believed, and how they organized their world, is genuinely fascinating in its own right. The Iron Age in Britain begins around 800 BCE and continues in many respects until the Roman conquest in 43 CE. During this period, the landscape of Britain was dominated by a particular kind of settlement, the hillfort. Hillforts are exactly what they sound like, settlements built on hilltops and enclosed by substantial defensive earthworks, banks, and ditches that followed the contours of the hill and could reach truly impressive proportions. The largest of them, sites like Maiden Castle in Dorset, or Hereford Beacon, or Danbury in Hampshire, were not merely defensive structures, they were communities, substantial ones with evidence of dense occupation within their ramparts, grain storage pits, workshops, and the remains of roundhouses that were occupied continuously for generations. Maiden Castle is perhaps the most dramatic example in England. Its multiple concentric rings of earthwork, following the contours of a high chalk hill cover an area of nearly 50 acres. Walking around the base of those ramparts today, looking up at the steep faces of the outer earthworks, you feel the intention behind them. This was a place that was meant to be impressive, meant to communicate power and permanence, and the ability to organize collective defense. But Maiden Castle also tells a story of change and conflict. When the Roman forces arrived in the mid-1st century CE, under the general Vespasian, later to become emperor, they systematically reduced the hill forts of the Durotrigus tribe in what is now Dorset at Maiden Castle, and excavations in the 1930s, under Mortimer Wheeler, uncovered a war cemetery near the Eastern Gateway. 38 bodies, men, women, and at least one child, showing evidence of violent death. Some had Roman ballista bolts embedded in their bones. Some showed sword cuts. They were buried hastily in a shallow pit. This was a real event. Real people defending a place they had lived in and considered their own against a power that had crossed a sea to claim their land for an empire. The Romans won. They almost always won. But the fact of a war cemetery at Maiden Castle is a reminder that conquest is not an abstraction. It is bodies in pits. It is someone's family. It is the end of something that had been continuous for a very long time. Iron Age society, tribe, kinship, and honor before we follow the Romans onto the island and let us spend a moment in the world they were entering. Because Iron Age Britain was not a vacuum of civilization waiting to be filled. The society that the Romans encountered in Britain was organized along tribal lines with regional kingdoms whose territories and power structures are partly visible through the distribution of distinctive material culture. The Iceni, in what is now Norfolk and Suffolk, the Cativani, in what is now Hertfordshire and the East Midlands, the Trinovantes in Essex, the Atrebates in the south, the Brigantes in the north, the Saluras, Ordovices, and Demetae in Wales, each with its own identity, its own kings or ruling families, its own alliances and rivalries. These societies were hierarchical. The evidence of burial, always a useful window into social structure, shows clear differentiation, and some individuals were buried with great wealth, swords and shields of extraordinary craftsmanship, mirrors of polished bronze, so finely worked that their engraved backs are considered among the finest artistic productions of prehistoric Britain, horse harnesses that indicate the importance of horses as status symbols, iron fire dogs that held the spit over the hearth in a feasting hall, suggesting a life of conspicuous hospitality. Feasting was important, almost impossibly important by modern standards. The hall where the chieftain or king feasted their followers was a social and political institution as much as a physical space. It was where status was displayed, where loyalty was cemented, where the bonds of obligation between a leader and their people were enacted and renewed. The generosity of the feast was a form of political speech, and beyond the halls and the hillforts, the landscape itself was marked with significance. We find in the Iron Age a particular devotion to rivers, lakes, and bogs. These liminal places, boundaries between the human world and whatever lay beyond it, were the sites of extraordinary offerings. Objects were deposited in water and wetland in numbers that defy any interpretation as accidental loss. Fine metalwork, weapons of obvious quality, occasionally human remains. The Celtic world, as far as we can reconstruct its spiritual character from these fragmentary evidences, appears to have been one in which the natural world was understood as inhabited by powers that required acknowledgement and relationship, not gods in the remote, systematic sense of later classical religion, though the Celt certainly had deities with names and functions, but a more pervasive sense of the sacred in the land itself. The famous Iron Age shield found in the river Tempames at Batisi is perhaps the most beautiful object of its kind in existence. Made of bronze, its surface decorated with swirling patterns of extraordinary complexity and precision. It was found in the river and was almost certainly placed there intentionally, not lost. Offered, someone made that shield. Someone or many people in a workshop somewhere over many hours created something of extraordinary beauty, and then it went into the water. We do not know for whom. We do not know what was asked or given in return. But the act itself, the deliberate offering of something precious to a power inhabiting a river, is a completely recognizable act of faith. And humans have always done this. In every culture that has ever existed, there is evidence of offering, of acknowledging something larger than oneself, and marking that acknowledgement with sacrifice. Whatever the specific beliefs of the Iron Age Britons, and they were surely varied and complex, this impulse is one we share with them across the great distance of years. The Romans come in 55 and 54 B.C.E. Julius Caesar made 2 expeditionary incursions into Britain. They were military and diplomatic events, but not a conquest. The legions came, demonstrated Roman power, took hostages and tribute promises, and withdrew. It was not until 43 CE, under the Emperor Claudius, that Rome seriously attempted to incorporate Britain into the empire. The invasion force of 4 legions and auxiliary troops, perhaps 40,000 soldiers in total. I crossed the Channel and established a beachhead. Within a few decades, Rome controlled much of what is now England and Wales, though Scotland remained largely unconquered and was eventually divided from Roman Britain by Hadrian Wall and later the Antonine Wall. For nearly 4 centuries, from the Claudian invasion to the final withdrawal of Roman troops in the early 5th century CE, Britain was part of the Roman Empire. This is such an enormous fact that it is difficult to fully absorb. Nearly 400 years, the entire period from the founding of Jamestown to today, is roughly 400 years. The entire period of European settlement in North America. Britain was Roman for that long. What did that mean? It meant different things in different places and at different times. In the south and east, and particularly in the years following conquest, Romanization was rapid and deep. Roman towns were established on a grid plan, with forums and temples and basilicas and amphitheaters and public baths. Londinium became one of the most significant cities in the Northwestern Empire. St. Albans Veruium was given the status of a Roman municipium, a town with full Roman civic rights. The Roman road network spread across the province with characteristic efficiency, straight lines across the landscape, connecting military installations and civilian towns. Their courses so direct that many modern roads still follow them. Their surfaces so well engineered that sections of Roman road surface are still occasionally encountered beneath more recent tarmac. But Roman Britain was not a simple replacement of one culture with another. It was nourishifed, as all conquests are, a complex negotiation. The British aristocracy, those who chose to work with Roman power rather than resist it, adapted. They built Roman-style villas with underfloor heating and decorative mosaics. They learned Latin. They adopted Roman names, or more precisely, they combined Roman and British names in ways that acknowledged both identities. They dressed in Roman-style clothing and used Roman-style pottery and lit their houses with Roman-style oil lamps. But they also kept cattle in ways their ancestors would have recognized. They honored gods whose names were British, even when they gave those gods Roman form. They buried their dead with goods that mixed Roman and British traditions. They were not Roman. They were Romano-British, which is something different, a hybrid identity created at the intersection of two worlds. And beneath the Romanized surface, the rural landscape of Britain continued in patterns of land use and settlement that had more continuity with the pre-Roman past than the gleaming, public buildings of the towns might suggest. Boudicca, the rebellion that shook Rome. In 60 or 61 CE, something happened in the province of Britannia that the Romans found genuinely alarming. Prasutus, king of the Iceni tribe in what is now Norfolk and Suffolk, died. He had ruled as a client king under Roman authority, and his will attempted to divide his kingdom between him, the Emperor Nero, and his two daughters, presumably hoping to preserve some continuity for his family and his people. The Romans ignored the will entirely. Roman administrators annexed the Eni kingdom directly. Roman soldiers and financial officials arrived and behaved with extraordinary brutality. The lands of Iceni nobles were confiscated. Prasu Tigas's widow, Boudicca, was flogged. Her daughters were sexually assaulted. The Romans had miscalculated badly. Boudicca led an uprising that drew in not only the Itani, but the neighboring Trinantes tribe, who had their own grievances against Roman oppression, and eventually up to 100,000 warriors if we trust the Roman sources, though such numbers from ancient writers should always be treated with caution. The rebellion was devastating. Camu Ladunum Colchester, the first Roman capital of the province, was sacked and burned. Its inhabitants were killed in ways that Roman writers described with visible horror. A Londinium was abandoned to the rebels and burned. Verulamium, St. Albans suffered the same fate. The archaeological evidence for these events is striking. A layer of red-orange burning, the remnants of the destruction, is still visible in excavations beneath the modern cities of Colchester and London and St. Albans. This layer, sometimes called the Boudiccan destruction horizon, is a physical trace of that moment in 60 or 61 CE, when the province came apart. The Roman governor Gasonius Paulinus was in Wales at the time, attacking the island of Anglesey, which was considered a center of Druidic resistance. He force-marched his troops south, chose a battlefield with great care, and met Boudicca's forces in a confrontation whose exact location is still debated, but was most likely somewhere in the East Midlands. The result, and in military terms, was a Roman victory. Boudicca, according to Roman accounts, either died in the battle or took poison afterward rather than be captured. But Boudicca's story did not end there. It transformed across the centuries into something else entirely. In the 19th century, at the height of British imperial expansion and the reign of Victoria, another warrior queen, whose name was a version of the same ancient root, Boudicca, was rehabilitated as a symbol of British courage and resistance. A statue of her in her chariot stands today on the Thames embankment near Westminster Bridge. Her spear raised her daughters behind her. The Romans who conquered her became the foreign invaders. The Briton who fought them became the patriot. History is always a conversation between past and present. Awesome. Hadrian's Wall, the edge of the world. In 120 CE, the Emperor Hadrian visited his British province. What he saw in the north concerned him. The frontier was unstable, the peoples beyond Roman control. The various tribes that Roman sources bundled together as Caledonians could not easily be incorporated into the empire. The Scottish Highlands are not amendable to the kind of systematic provincial administration that Rome was good at. Hadrian's solution was characteristically Roman. Build something. The wall that bears his name runs for 73 miles from Wools, end on the River Tyne in the east, to Bonus, on Solway, on the Solway FTH in the west. At its completion, it was roughly 3 to 5 meters high, with a wide ditch in front, a military road behind, and a series of forts and mile castles and signal towers along its length. 17 substantial forts were eventually built, each designed to house a unit of auxiliary soldiers. Standing on any section of Hadrian's Wall today, particularly on its most dramatic central section, where it follows the line of the windsill, a natural escarpment of dark volcanic rock that drops sharply to the north, you understand something about the Roman imperial imagination. This was not primarily a defensive wall, in the sense of a castle wall. You could not stop a determined army with it. It was a statement, a line drawn on the landscape that said, "Here the empire ends. Here begins something else." The soldiers who served on the wall came from across the empire. Inscriptions on the wall, and in its associated forts, record units from Syria and North Africa, from the Danube provinces, and from Spain, and from Gaul. These men, stationed at the far northern edge of the known world, brought their gods with them, small shrines and votive offerings that have been found in excavations at every fort along the Jew wall. Mithras, the sun god, popular in the Roman military, had a temple at Carob. Jupiter was honored at multiple sites, but alongside these soldiers, honored gods from their home provinces, whose names appear in inscriptions, and whose cults we can only glimpse. And the wall did not divide Roman from non-Roman as cleanly as its geometry might suggest. The territory immediately north of the wall was not enemy territory. It was frontier zone. Communities there participated in Roman economic life, trading with the garrisons, supplying them with food and goods, occasionally supplying soldiers to the auxiliary units. The wall was a border crossing as much as a barrier. At the fort of Vindolanda, just south of the wall, excavations have recovered one of the most extraordinary archives from Roman Britain. Hundreds of wooden writing tablets preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the boggy ground below the fort, their ink still readable after nearly 2,000 years. These tablets are not official correspondence. They are the daily paperwork of a military garrison, requests for leave, strength reports, requests for supplies, including a request for more beer, a birthday party invitation from one officer's wife to another, written in a careful cursive hand and then discarded or lost and lying in the ground ever since. The birthday invitation, Claudia C., to her Lepidina, greetings. On the third day before the Ides of September, Sister, for the day of the celebration of my birthday, I give you a warm invitation to make sure that you come to us, to make the day more enjoyable for me by your arrival, if you are present. Two women, on a military frontier, at the edge of the empire, maintaining the ordinary human rituals of friendship across the centuries. The end of Roman Britain. The Roman presence in Britain ended not with a dramatic conquest, but with a slow withdrawal and fragmentation. By the late 4th century CE, the Western Roman Empire was under intense pressure from multiple directions. Germanic peoples were pushing across the Rhine and Danube frontiers. The empire's political center of gravity had shifted permanently to the east. Troops were regularly withdrawn from Britain for campaigns elsewhere, and by the early 5th century, the process had become terminal. The traditional date for the end of Roman Britain is 410 CE, when the Emperor Honorius sent a rescript to the cities of Britain, telling them essentially to look to their own defense. This has often been interpreted as an official abandonment of the province, though the reality was more gradual and complex than that date implies. What happened in Britain after the end of Roman administration is one of the most debated topics in British history. The period is called variously the post-Roman period, the Dark Ages, the early medieval period, the Age of Arthur. That last name is significant. The vacuum of evidence from this period has been filled in the popular imagination by legend. The reality, as archaeology has revealed it, is both more complex and more interesting than either darkness or legend. Roman towns did not immediately cease to be occupied. Some show continuity of settlement for decades after 410. The villa estates of the rural south did not all suddenly collapse, though many were abandoned within a generation or two of the Roman withdrawal. The road network remained in use. The Christian Church, which had established itself in Britain during the 4th century, persisted, and in some areas grew, but the material culture changed dramatically. Coin use ceased. Fine pottery imports from the continent dried up. The complex economic networks that had tied Britain into the broader Roman economic system fell apart. People were not necessarily poorer in all senses, but the visible, countable, datable archaeological record becomes very thin, and into this thinness, new peoples arrived. The Anglo-Saxons, for the groups of people from what is now northwest Germany and southern Denmark, began settling in eastern Britain in the 5th century. Whether this was a mass migration that displaced the existing population, or a more gradual process of elite replacement and cultural change is still debated, and the answer probably varies by region and time period. But the genetic evidence again tells a story of significant population movement in eastern England, particularly the early medieval population, shows substantial ancestry from continental, Germanic groups. In the west, in Wales and Devon, and Cornwall and Cumbria, and southern Scotland, the British population and British language and culture were more persistent. The Brittonic languages, ancestors of Welsh and Cornish and Breton, continued to be spoken, and the memory of Roman Britain was preserved in an intellectual and ecclesiastical culture that maintained Latin literacy. And out of this complex period of transformation, out of the mixing of Roman, British, and Germanic and Irish influences in different proportions in different parts of the island, something new began to emerge. Britain, as we would eventually recognize it, the saints, and the sacred landscape. Before we follow the story into the medieval period, there is a thread that deserves particular attention, because woven through all of the changes of the post-Roman centuries is a religious transformation that reshaped the landscape of Britain as profoundly as any conquest. Christianity had arrived in Britain during the Roman period. The first attested British martyr, Saint Alban, was executed during the Diocletianic persecution of the early 4th century in the town of Veruium, which was subsequently renamed in his honor. By the time the Roman administration withdrew, there were Christian communities in the towns, and possibly among the rural elite. But the spread of Christianity through the entire population, including the rural majority, and then into the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that established themselves in the east, was the work of the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. This is the age of the Celtic saints in Wales and Cornwall, and Ireland and Scotland. A tradition of monastic Christianity developed that was distinctively different in character from the Roman ecclesiastical model. Hermits sought remote places, islands, caves, cliff tops. Monasteries were founded in places that seem impossibly isolated. The Rock stacks off the Kerry coast, the wind-swept islands of the Hebrides, the mountain valleys of Snowdonia. These places were not chosen despite their remoteness, but because of it. The wild places of the earth were understood as closer to God, less cluttered with the distractions of human society. The saints who inhabited them were not fleeing the world, but seeking a more direct encounter with the divine. Saint Columba, sailing from Ireland in the late 6th century, to found his monastery on the tiny island of Iona, off the west coast of Scotland, describes the crossing of the sea as itself a spiritual act. Leaving behind of one world for another, Iona became one of the most significant centers of Christian learning in Western Europe. Its monks produced the Book of Kells, that extraordinary illuminated manuscript, whose carpet, pages, and zoomorphic interlacing represent one of the summits of early medieval art. They sent missionaries to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the north, and at Lindisfarne, on a tidal island off the Northumbrian coast, another great monastery was founded. Its community, including men who had trained at Iona. The Lindisfarne Gospels, produced there in the early 8th century, are among the most beautiful books ever made. These monasteries were not just religious houses, they were centers of literacy and learning, of historical writing and legal codification, of craft production at the highest level. In the centuries after Rome, when the institutions that had maintained sophisticated, material culture in Britain had collapsed, it was the monasteries that preserved and extended the traditions of writing and education and artistry that would eventually feed back into the broader culture. They also, in their siting, reflected a continuing tradition of sacredness in the landscape. Many of the places the Celtic saints chose for their monasteries had been significant in earlier periods, locations that were understood as liminal, as where different worlds were close together. The pattern of sacred sites in Britain shows remarkable continuity across religious changes. Springs that were sacred in the Iron Age, were still sacred in the Roman period, became associated with Christian saints in the early medieval period, and in some cases are still visited today by people who leave offerings. This thread of continuity in how the British landscape is understood and used is in its way one of the most remarkable features of the island's long history. The Viking Age. The first recorded Viking raid on Britain came in 793 CE. The target was the monastery of Lindisfarne, that island of prayer and learning of the Northumbrian coast. The Lindisfarne community had no warning and no defense. The raiders came from the sea, as raiders in Britain had come for thousands of years, and the monastery, with its accumulated wealth of ecclesiastical treasure, its metalwork and manuscripts, was vulnerable in exactly the way that remote sacred communities tend to be, vulnerable to those who do not share their values. The Lindisfarne stone, carved in the aftermath of the raid, shows on one side a scene of the last judgment, angels blowing trumpets, the dead rising, Christ in majesty. On the other side, a frieze of armed warriors advancing with swords and axes raised. The shock of Viking raids on the settled communities of early medieval Britain was genuine and deep. The ecclesiastical writers who recorded these events used the language of divine punishment, of catastrophe, of the world turned upside down. But the Viking story is not only a story of raids and violence. From the 9th century onwards, Scandinavian settlers established permanent communities in Britain. The Danelaw law, the broad arc of territory from Yorkshire across the East Midlands to East Anglia, was settled by Danish Vikings to an extent that transformed the landscape. Place names ending in by and thorpe, Norse words for settlement, pepper, the map of northern and eastern England, Grimby, Selby, Whitby, Scunthorpe. The names of the landscape are a record of settlement, and in the northern and western islands in Orkney and Shetland and the Hebrides, Norse settlement was even more thorough. The pre-Norse population did not disappear, but Norsemen became the dominant cultural and political force. The islands became in effect Norse in language and culture, a status they retained for centuries. Jorvik, to its Scandinavian inhabitants, became one of the most significant Viking cities in the world. Its excavated remains, most famously explored at Coppergate and now interpreted at the Jorvik Viking Center, show a dense, prosperous urban settlement, its waterlogged layers preserving organic material of extraordinary diversity, leather shoes and wooden combs, food remains that tell us what people ate, human parasites that tell us about conditions of daily life, the accumulated debris of an intensely human place. The Vikings who settled in Britain were not only warriors, they were merchants, farmers, craftspeople, settlers. They intermarried with the existing population. Their descendants became over generations something neither purely Norse nor purely English, or Welsh or Scottish, but British, in the way that all the inhabitants of these islands eventually become, layered, mixed, carrying the memory of multiple arrivals in their surnames and their place names and their DNA. Alfred and the making of England against the Viking threat. One figure emerged who has come to occupy a central place in English historical memory. Alfred, King of Wessex from 871 to 899 CE, inherited a kingdom under extreme pressure. By 878, the Danish armies had overrun most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England, and Alfred himself was reduced to hiding in the Somerset marshes. The legendary story of the cakes, burned because a fugitive king was distracted from his domestic duties while pondering military strategy. But Alfred did not give up. He raised an army. He met the Danish king Guthrum at Edington in Wiltshire and defeated him. And crucially, he then negotiated the Treaty of Wedmore, divided England between a reconstituted Wessex in the south and the Danelaw in the north and east. Guthrum was baptized as a Christian, with Alfred as his godfather. It was a political masterstroke. By converting his enemy, Alfred both neutralized a religious distinction that had been used to characterize the conflict and created a personal bond of obligation with a rival who was now in a formal, spiritual sense, his son. But Alfred's significance goes beyond military and diplomatic skill. He was also remarkably an intellectual. He translated Latin texts into Old English, making the learning of the Church accessible to people who could not read Latin. He established schools. He promoted literacy as a tool of governance, understanding that a kingdom needed educated administrators, and he began the project of writing what we now call the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a systematic record of English history that would be continued by monks across the following 2.5 centuries, becoming the oldest history of any European people written in a vernacular language. Alfred's descendants continued his project. His son Edward the Elder and his grandson Ethelstan pushed north, incorporating more of the former Danelaw into a political entity that was increasingly being called England, a kingdom of the Angles. By 927 CE, Ethelstan had been recognized as king by the rulers of Scotland and Strathclyde and Wales, and could claim, with some justification, to be king of all Britain, or at least the first king to make that claim with any geographic plausibility. So England, in other words, was not an ancient fact. It was a political project constructed across a specific historical moment in the 9th and 10th centuries out of the crucible of Viking pressure and political vision, the Normans, and the final transformation. There is a date that every British schoolchild learns: 1066. The Battle of Hastings, or more precisely, the battle fought at Senlac Hill, a few miles from Hastings, on the 14th of October, 1066. So it ended with the death of King Harold II of England and the victory of William, Duke of Normandy, who thereafter styled himself William the Conqueror and King of England. The Norman conquest was in some ways the the most complete transformation of English culture that the island had experienced since the Bronze Age population replacement. Not because it involved mass settlement, the Norman ruling class was relatively small in number, but because it imposed a new ruling elite so comprehensively, and that elite spoke a different language and had a different legal and cultural tradition. Old English, the language of Alfred and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, became the language of the peasantry. Norman French was the language of the court, the administration, the aristocracy. Latin remained the language of the church. For several centuries, where England was a linguistically divided society, and the English, language that emerged from this period, what we now call Middle English, is a monument to the merger of Germanic and Romance influences. Castles appeared on the British landscape in numbers and with a speed that would have been impossible without Norman organizing capacity and Norman ambition. The Normans were builders on a grand scale. The Tower of London, Rochester Castle, Windsor Castle, Durham Cathedral, Canterbury Cathedral, Norwich Cathedral. These buildings transformed the visual and material culture of England, and many of them still dominate the landscapes and skylines of English towns and cities today. But the Normans also transformed the countryside. The feudal system they imposed, whatever it had been in practice before, became more precisely codified. Then the Domesday Book of 1086, William's great survey of his new kingdom, is itself a monument to Norman administrative ambition, a systematic accounting of every manor, every estate, every mill and church and fish pond in the realm for the purposes of taxation and the assertion of royal sovereignty. England by the end of the 11th century was one of the most thoroughly governed kingdoms in the Western Europe, and the island that had seen Dogon peoples and Neolithic hunters and Neolithic farmers and Bronze Age chieftains and Iron Age warriors and Romans and Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. The island whose soil contained the charcoal of 100 generations of fires and the bones of 1,000 years of ancestors had become recognizably, if not entirely, comfortably, the beginning of what it would eventually become. Ran's what the stones remember. The sky over Britain is rarely clear. The clouds come in from the Atlantic, grey and patient, and the light that filters through them is cool and soft. A light that suits the old stones and the old hills. On any clear night from anywhere on this island, if you drive far enough from the orange glow of the towns, you can see the same stars that looked as down on the builders of Stonehenge, the same stars that oriented the long Barrows to the east, the same stars that guided the Bronze Age sailors across the North Sea, the same stars under which the Iron Age farmer banked their fires against the winter dark. We tend to think of the past as gone, but the past is very thick here. It is in the landscape, in the layers of sediment, and the earthworks, and the hedgerow lines that follow ancient field boundaries, and it is in the place names, the Cester endings that betray a Roman fort, the Ley endings that record a woodland clearing, the Thorpe endings that remember a Norse settler. It is in the very shape of the land, which has been worked and re-rowed for so long, that there is no natural land left in Britain. The uplands are shaped by millennia of sheep grazing. The land plains are drained by systems of ditches and drains that go back in many cases to the medieval period. The rivers have been diverted and embanked and managed for so long that their current courses represent centuries of human decision-making as much as natural hydrology. This is a human landscape. It has been a human landscape for a very long time, and within it, the traces of all those who came before persist. The long barrow on the ridge feed the earthwork on the hill, the place where the road makes a slight kink, following for no obvious reason the line of a much older path, the field name that preserves a word in a language no longer spoken, the church built on a spring that was sacred long before Christianity came to the island. Britain is layered, and the layers do not simply overwrite each other, they accumulate, the later sites on top of the earlier, but the earlier persists, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, always present in some form. We are not the first civilization to build here. We will not be the last, but we are the inheritors of all that was built before us, whether we know the names of the builders or not. The long conversation. There is something comforting in the depth of this history. Not comforting because it diminishes the present, or makes our own concerns seem insignificant, in the face of such spans of time, but comforting because it demonstrates that this land has been home, has been cared for, has been worked, and loved, and quarreled over, and preyed upon, and farmed, and built upon, and mourned by people who were as fully human as we are, for longer than we can easily imagine. The person who stood inside the West Kennet Long Barrow 5,000 years ago, in the light of torches, rearranging the bones of their ancestors, was a person. They had a body that ached after hard work. They had people they loved, and people they found difficult. They had particular foods they preferred, and particular times of day when they were tired. They had dreams at night that sometimes frightened them, and sometimes brought them comfort. We do not know what they thought. We do not know what language they spoke, what stories they told, what they believed about why the sun came up each morning, or what happened to people after they died. But they stood in the same wind. They looked at the same stars. They felt the same autumn chill and the same midwinter relief when the days began to lengthen, and they built things that are still standing 5,000 years later. That act of building, that insistence on leaving something permanent in the landscape, is itself a kind of communication across time. They did not know us. They could not have imagined us, but they made something that we can stand beside and touch and look at. And in that act of looking, we are briefly in contact across all the centuries between. The Long Barrow remembers. The stone circle remembers the hill fort, and the Roman road, and the Viking place name, and the Sir Norman castle, all remember. The land itself, if you know how to read it, is a library without end. Closing. The wind moves across the downs. The stars are out tonight. The same stars that always were somewhere under the chalk, under the layers of Roman occupation, and Anglo-Saxon field systems, and medieval ploughing, and modern development. The bones of the first farmers lie in the dark, as they have lain for 5,000 years. They were not the first people here. They, too, built on the bones of those who came before. The Mesolithic hunter who made that barbed spear point, the one found in the peat of the Dogger Bank by a fishing trawler in 1931, lived in a world that is now at the bottom of the sea. Their homeland is gone. Their language is gone. Their stories are their beliefs. Their names for the animals they hunted and the rivers they crossed, all of it gone. But the spear point remained preserved in the peat for 9,000 years, patient and precise, the work of human hands. Wherever you are tonight, wherever you are lying in the dark, the ground beneath you has a story. You are not the first to sleep on it. You are not the first to dream there. And somewhere in the long river of human life that has flowed across these islands since the land's first feet touched the ground after the ice, you belong. Let the long history of this place be around you now like warmth. Let the old stones stand in the dark. Let the barrows hold their silence on the hillsides. Let the rivers run to the sea. You are part of this, a breath in a long and long conversation that began before memory and will continue after. Everything we know has been transformed into something else entirely. The stars are the same stars. Sleep now. The ancient trackways. There is a network of paths on this island that predates every monument, every town, every road. These are the ancient trackways, and they are among the oldest human-made features still visible in the British landscape. The oldest trackways follow the high ground. This is not accidental. The ridges and downs of southern England offered travellers advantages that the valleys could not. Drier ground, because the chalk and limestone drained quickly. Better visibility, because from high ground you can see threats approaching, and you can orient yourself across great distances and firmer footing through much of the year. Because the valley bottoms in a pre-drained landscape were often boggy, impassable in winter and spring. The Ridgeway, that ancient road along the chalk ridge of what is now Oxfordshire and Wiltshire, is perhaps the most famous of these ancient routes. Parts of it are certainly Neolithic in use, and sections may have been walked continuously since the Mesolithic period. It connects, or once connected, a chain of significant prehistoric sites from the Tempeme, crossing at Strately in the east, to Abbury and beyond in the west. Walking the ridgeway today, particularly in the early morning, when the light is low and the dew is still on the grass, and the distant hills are blue in the haze, it is possible to feel something that can only be described as the weight of feet. Not a supernatural sensation exactly, but an awareness of density. This path has been walked so many times, by so many people, over so many thousands of years, that it seems worn, not just into the earth, but into time itself. The Sweet Track, preserved in the Somerset levels, is even older, and in some ways more remarkable. Dated to approximately 3087 BCE, based on the precise dating possible from the distinctive rings in the timber used in its construction. It is one of the oldest engineered roadways in the world, a boardwalk of planks, laid on rails, spanning approximately 2 kilometers across the marshland of the part. Somerset levels, providing a dry path across ground that would otherwise have been impassable. The level of craft in the Sweet Track is extraordinary. The builders selected specific types of wood for specific purposes: ashwood and lime for the main rails, oak for the pegs that held the structure together. They planned the route in advance, which required knowledge of the terrain and the season and the likely behavior of the water table. The track was not improvised. It was engineered, and along its length, in the peat that preserved it so perfectly. Archaeologists have found objects dropped or deliberately placed. A polished jadeite axe of extraordinary quality, its stone imported from the Alps. A wooden dish still containing hazelnuts, animal bones, the accumulation of loss and offering that marks any frequently traveled path. The jade axe in particular speaks to the world of long-distance connection. Jadeite, of the type used in its manufacture, comes from sources in the western Alps of northern Styrian Italy. It was quarried, probably at altitude, and transported by sea and land across France to Britain. Fashioned into a polished axe of ceremonial rather than practical quality, and then deposited in a Somerset marsh beside a wooden walkway. Whose axe was it? We cannot know, but we can be certain that it mattered. The labor invested in its creation, the distance it had traveled, the care with which it was made, all suggest an object of considerable significance. And it ended its journey in the mud of the Somerset levels 5,500 years ago, where it waited for discovery. There is something about deliberately losing a valuable thing, something about the willingness to give up what is precious. It speaks to a belief in something beyond the immediate transaction of daily life, a faith in exchange with forces that cannot be seen. They look the sacred springs of Britain. Long before the Romans arrived with their engineering and their pantheon, the springs of Britain were sacred. A spring emerging from the ground is, when you stop to think about it, genuinely mysterious. Water appearing from the earth itself, flowing at a constant temperature, regardless of the season, sometimes with distinctive colors or smells, sometimes with apparent healing properties. Springs were, for the pre-scientific mind, and perhaps for the genuinely attentive modern mind as well, genuinely numinous things, places where something from below came to meet the world above. The Romans, when they arrived in Britain, encountered a landscape thick with spring cults and, with characteristic Roman practicality and cultural flexibility, they did not attempt to suppress these cults. They accommodated them as they gave the British spring deities Roman names or identified them with Roman equivalents. They built temples and bathing structures at the most significant spring sites, turning local sacred places into imperial ones. The most spectacular example is at Bath. Bath sits in a valley of the River Avon in Somerset, and at its center is a spring that produces approximately 1–2 million litres of hot water per day, emerging at a constant temperature of 45 degrees Celsius. This spring is unique in Britain. There is no other natural hot ring of comparable flow anywhere on the island. The Romans called the settlement Aquilis, the waters of Sulis. Sulis was an existing British goddess associated with the spring, and the Romans identified her with Minerva, their goddess of wisdom and crafts. And the temple they built to Sulis Minerva was one of the most impressive in Roman Britain. Its carved pediment, showing a gorgon's head, surrounded by swirling hair and flanked by tritons and victories, is one of the finest pieces of Romano-British sculpture that survives. The Great Bath itself, the lead-lined pool fed by the spring, was a place of both recreation and devotion. People came from across the province and from elsewhere in the empire to bathe in the sacred hot water. They threw offerings into the spring, coins, jewelry, objects of personal significance, and sometimes they threw curses. Among the most remarkable finds from the sacred spring at Bath are the curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with appeals to Sulis Minerva to punish those who had wronged the author. Stolen goods were a common pretext. And may he who carried off Vilia from me become liquid like water. I give to the goddess Sulis the lead tablet with these names, whether pagan or Christian, whether man or woman, whether boy or girl, whether slave or free, all those who have stolen from me. These are real voices, real frustrations, real appeals to a divine power to intervene in the petty injustices of daily life. They are recognizably human, in a way that formal religious inscriptions sometimes are not. The spring at Bath continued to be sacred after the Roman period. The Anglo-Saxons acknowledged it. Medieval visitors came for the healing waters. The Georgian rebuilding of the city created the elegant crescents and terraces that make Bath one of the most architecturally distinguished cities in England. But beneath all that Georgian elegance, the spring still flows. Avon at its constant temperature, as it has flowed for as long as humans have lived near it. At Howley in North Wales, a spring associated with St. Winfried has been a pilgrimage destination since at least the medieval period, and possibly much longer. The well at Howley Well is the only pre-Reformation pilgrimage site in Britain that has been in continuous use since its establishment. People still come. They still lower themselves into the cold, clear water. They still leave offerings. The impulse to make a spring sacred and to seek healing and intervention from whatever power inhabits it. This impulse has proved extraordinarily persistent. The art hidden in the ground, British prehistory, produced art of extraordinary quality and variety, though much of it has been hidden from us for millennia. The rock art of the uplands is among the oldest. Cup and ring marks, circular depressions hammered into exposed rock surfaces, sometimes surrounded by concentric rings, sometimes connected by carved channels, appear across northern Britain in Northland and Yorkshire and Scotland, and particularly on Ilkmore in West Yorkshire, where the swastika stone and the panorama stone and dozens of other carved rocks sit on the high mand above the town. The cup and ring marks date primarily to the Neolithic and early Bronze Age, though some may be older. Their meaning is one of British archaeology's most persistent mysteries. They are clearly intentional, clearly produced with effort and care, clearly not random, but what they represented to the people who made them remains uncertain. Various interpretations have been proposed. The maps of the landscape, representations of the sky, particularly the spiral galaxy or the sun, symbols marking territorial boundaries, part of astronomical or calendar systems, markers for routes or resources, elements in shamanic or trans experience. The range of proposals reflects both the genuine ambiguity of the evidence and the difficulty of interpreting abstract marks without any cultural context. What we can say is that the people who made these marks spent significant time and effort on them. The hammering required to produce deep cup marks in hard moorland rock is considerable. This was not casual scratching. It was intentional, repeated, careful work, and the locations chosen for the marks were often places with extensive views, hilltops and ridges where the horizon was wide. Looking at a cup and ring marked stone on a high moor, looking out over the spread of hills and valleys below, and trying to understand what the person who made those marks was trying to communicate, or to whom, or why this particular rock, on this particular hillside, seemed the right place for this act, is one of the more genuinely humbling experiences that prehistoric Britain can offer. You simply do not know, and that ignorance is not a failure of archaeology. It is a genuine encounter with radical difference. Later, prehistoric art becomes more accessible to us, or at least more familiar in its modes. The metalwork of the late Bronze Age and Iron Age achieves a level of virtuosity that still impresses. The battery shield mentioned earlier, with its sinuous curvier decoration, the Waterloo helmet, a bronze ceremonial helmet, also from the Tempams, with its characteristic horns, the brighter collar from Ireland, a gold tawse of such technical perfection that modern goldsmiths have struggled to understand how it was made. These are not the products of a primitive culture. They are the products of a sophisticated artistic tradition with a long history of development, drawing on influences from across the Celtic world and beyond, responding to and developing visual conventions with the kind of sophistication that implies specialist training and a community of shared aesthetic understanding. The animals and humans that appear in British Iron Age art are rarely shown naturalistically. They flow, transform, become abstract, share features with plants and geometric patterns. A human face might emerge from a pattern of scrolls, or ballam. A beast's body might dissolve into interlacing curves. This is an art that seems deliberately to resist fixed form, to emphasize transformation and multiplicity of meaning over clarity and singularity. Whether this formal tendency in the art reflects something about how the culture understood the natural world as essentially fluid and transformative rather than fixed and categorical, we cannot say with certainty, but the consistency of the tendency across a wide area and a long period suggests that it was meaningful, not merely decorative. Art is always argument. It always embodies a way of seeing. The art of Iron Age Britain argues for a world of flowing forms and metamorphosis, of boundaries between things that are permeable rather than fixed. The River Thames as history. The River Thames runs through the heart of southern England, and for most of the year it looks unremarkable enough. A broad grey-brown river, moving at a gentle pace through a landscape that has been shaped by human occupation for so long that the word natural barely applies. But the Thames is a museum. The river's muddy bed has been receiving objects for thousands of years. Some fell in accidentally, many were deposited deliberately, and the combination of the river's central role in British life and the extraordinary, preservative qualities of riverine mud have produced an archaeological record of astonishing richness. The objects recovered from the Thames represent almost every period of British prehistory and history. Mesolithic flint tools, Bronze Age swords and axes, and personal ornaments, Iron Age shields and helmets and fire dogs, Roman altars and military equipment, and personal objects lost by the men who lived and worked along the riverbank. Medieval London's lost and discarded everyday life. The foreshore of the Thames in London, accessible at low tide, is still an active archaeological site. Thames mudlocks. People who search the foreshore for historical objects continue to find remarkable things. Roman coins, medieval pottery, 18th century clay pipes, objects of every period since people first settled on the river. But the most significant finds are the early ones. The Bronze Age and Iron Age weapons and ornaments found in the Thames are, as noted earlier, overwhelmingly likely to be deliberate deposits. Too many, too concentrated, too clearly valuable to be accidental losses. The Thames was for the Iron Age peoples of southern Britain something like a spine of the world. It ran through the heartland of the most densely populated and politically complex region of pre-Roman Britain. Its crossing points were strategic, its banks were the sites of significant settlements, and its water was inhabited by something that required placation and relationship. The famous Waterloo helmet, a bronze-horned helmet found in the Tempermaze near Waterloo Bridge in the 19th century, is perhaps the most dramatic example. It was not a battle helmet. The thin bronze it is made of would not have withstood a blow. It was ceremonial, perhaps worn for ritual purposes, perhaps the helmet of a king or a priest, or both, and it ended up in the river, given deliberately. The Iron Age peoples of Britain were surrounded by rivers that they understood as inhabited. The water spirits, the goddesses, and gods of streams and springs, and great rivers, received offerings regularly. The wealth sunk in the Tempermaze alone, across the pre-Roman period, represents an investment of material resources that must have been significant even by the standards of prosperous Iron Age communities. What were they asking for? Victory in war, probably good harvests, protection from sickness, the safe delivery of children, the ordinary hopes of any community that understands itself to be dependent on forces beyond its control. What did they receive in return? The river kept flowing, the water kept coming, cold and brown and patient, carrying the offerings away downstream, out to sea, beyond sight, beyond reach. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the act of giving, the willingness to part with something precious and watch it go was, itself, the thing that mattered. The chalk figures on the hillsides of southern England, cut into the chalk downland, are figures of animals and giants whose age and meaning have been debated for centuries. The most famous is the White Horse of Uffington in Oxfordshire, not far from the Ridgeway and the ancient landscape of Wan Smiddy and the hill of Dragon Hill. The Uffington White Horse is not a naturalistic portrait. It is a flowing abstract form, its body drawn in continuous curves, its legs stylized, its head reduced to a beak-like projection. It looks, in fact, remarkably like the horse figures that appear in late Bronze Age and Iron Age metalwork, particularly on coins, dated by optically stimulated luminescence to the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age around 1400 to 600 B.C.E. T.E., and the Uffington White Horse is among the oldest hill figures in Britain. It sits on a chalk hillside below the ancient ridge, and from the valley below it is visible for many miles on a clear day. Why was it made? The question is actually more subtle than it sounds, because the White Horse was clearly maintained across its entire history. You cannot simply cut a figure in chalk and expect it to remain visible. The chalk weathers, and grass grows over it, and within a generation the figure would be invisible, if not periodically scoured, the turf cut back, and the white chalk freshened. Maintaining the Uffington White Horse across 3,000 years required a continuous commitment to the task. Generation after generation, someone organized the scouring. Someone gathered the people together, perhaps during a festival, and perhaps as a communal obligation associated with the ceremonies of the adjacent hill, thought of Uffington Castle, and did the work. The scouring was itself a social occasion. Local traditions recorded in historical sources described the scouring of the White Horse as a festival with games and entertainment, a gathering of communities from the surrounding area. The maintenance of the figure was an excuse for community assembly, and community assembly was an excuse for the maintenance of the figure. The figure and the community that maintained it created each other. Other chalk figures in Britain are more enigmatic. The Long Man of Wilmington in East Sussex, a tall outlined male figure holding two staves, was of uncertain date, possibly medieval, possibly much older. The Cerne Abbas giant in Dorset, a large figure holding a club, and is similarly contested in terms of its origins, though it has been a recognized feature of the landscape since at least the 17th century. What unites these figures is their scale and their permanence. They occupy the landscape in a way that demands acknowledgement. You cannot ignore a figure cut into a hillside. It asserts itself, it makes a claim on the viewer's attention. These are not quiet art. They are declarations, the medieval inheritance of the ancient landscape. The medieval period in Britain, broadly from the Norman conquest in 1066 to the Reformation of the 16th century, overlaid the ancient landscape with a new set of meanings and structures. But it did not erase the old ones. The great cathedrals of medieval England were built in many cases as on or near sites that had been sacred for much longer than Christianity had existed in Britain. Canterbury, the seat of the Archbishop and the most important pilgrimage destination in medieval England, had been a significant settlement since the Iron Age. York Minster sits in the heart of Roman Eboracum, the principal Roman military base and capital of the northern province. Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, was a significant Iron Age settlement before the Romans built there. The Norman builders were not unaware of this continuity. In some cases, they were explicitly building over or incorporating earlier sacred structures, asserting the new faith's dominance over the old. But in others, the choice of site reflected a pragmatic acknowledgement that certain places accumulated significance over time and that building on them was a way of accessing that accumulated power. The village church of almost any English village shows this pattern in miniature. The churchyard with its ancient yew trees often predates the church itself. Yews were planted in sacred enclosures long before Christianity arrived, and many of the great churchyard yews of England are thousands of years old. The circular churchyard which appears across Britain, particularly in areas of Celtic cultural continuity in the West, reflects the circular sacred enclosures of the pre-Christian period. The church was built inside the yew grove. The yew grove was already there, and the festivals of the medieval church calendar, and whatever their official theological significance, mapped onto the seasonal rhythms that had been marked ceremonially in Britain since long before Christianity. Christmas, the mid-winter festival. Easter, the spring festival. The harvest festivals of autumn. The midsummer celebrations of June. These were not Christian inventions. They were Christianizations of observances that were ancient when the first missionaries arrived. The people of medieval Britain were not dimly aware of this. They lived in a landscape that was thick with the residue of earlier periods. The long barrows and round barrows were visible features of the countryside, their origins unknown, but their presence undeniable. The stone circles were standing. The hillforts were earthworks that cattle grazed on warm afternoons. These places accumulated legend. Byn smithy became the workshop of the mythological smith. Glastonbury Tor, with its ancient associations with the sacred island rising from the Somerset marshes, became the Isle of Avalon of Arthurian legend. The White Horse of Uffington became connected to St. George and his dragon, the adjacent hill of Dragon Hill, supposedly the place where the saint slew the beast. Each period reinterpreted what it inherited. The old forms persisted, but their meanings were translated, updated, made legible in new cultural languages. This is not corruption or misunderstanding. It is how living cultures work. The past is never simply preserved. It is always being actively made sense of by the present. The landscape of the living dead. There is a landscape in Britain that is simultaneously ancient and completely ordinary, and every village has one. Every town has several. They are so common, so expected, so thoroughly familiar that we have entirely stopped noticing what strange places they are. The churchyard. In a churchyard, the dead lie in the same ground as the living stand on. The boundary between the community of the living and the community of the dead is marked by nothing more than a low wall or a wooden fence. You can lean over it. Children can climb over it. Dogs wander through. This proximity of the dead to the living is, when you think about it, as an anthropological fact, rather than an architectural convention, deeply significant. Britain is a country where the dead are kept close. The tradition long predates the Christian Church. We have seen how the Neolithic long barrows placed the bones of the dead in prominent positions in the landscape and accessible, revisitable. The Bronze Age round barrows that dot the ridges and hills of the British countryside, visible for miles around, were not hidden. They were deliberately prominent, asserting the presence of particular ancestors in particular places. The dead were landmarks. They told the living where they were. They organized the landscape of memory and belonging. When Christianity arrived, and the churchyard became the primary space of burial, it inherited this tradition. The churchyard was in the community, part of the community, tended by the community. People knew where their dead were. They could visit them. They could talk to them, which was not encouraged by the official church, but was practiced nonetheless. And the landscape that had accumulated layers of dead people across the millennia, the fields and hills and valley bottoms of Britain, was understood as inhabited by more than the living. The ghost tradition in Britain is ancient, persistent, and geographically specific. British ghosts tend to be attached to places rather than to families. The particular bend in the road, the room in the old house, the hollow in the hillside, the spring. This is the landscape talking. The landscape that has been inhabited for so long by so many, under so many different understandings of what it meant to live and die here, that its accumulated human history sometimes seems to press through the surface of the present in particular places. Whether you believe in ghosts or not is a separate question. The tradition itself, the deep-rooted British sense, should particular places carry the memory of particular events or particular people in, is a cultural fact, and it is a fact that connects, however indirectly, to the oldest practices of this island. The dead do not simply go away here. They have never simply gone away. They accumulate in the landscape, like the layers of cultivation in an old field, invisible most of the time, present always. Rain and memory. It rains a great deal in Britain. This is simply a fact of the climate, and it has shaped the culture in ways that go far beyond the obvious. The wet climate of Britain is responsible for some of its most remarkable archaeological preservation. The bogs of Ireland and Scotland and Wales and England have preserved organic material that would have rotted away in drier conditions. Wood, leather, textiles, and most famously human bodies. The bog bodies of Britain and Ireland are among the most haunting artifacts of any period, preserved by the acidic anoxic conditions of the peat, some of them still showing skin and hair, and the expressions on their faces. They are genuinely extraordinary encounters with the ancient past. Lindo Man, found in a peat bog in Cheshire in 1984, died around the 1st century and CE. He was a well-nourished adult male, his nails trimmed, his beard recently shaved or cut. He had eaten a last meal of unleavened bread and possibly some plant foods. And then he died violently, struck on the head and garroted, and his throat cut. The triple death, as some scholars call it, the simultaneous use of multiple methods of killing, appears in some Irish mythology in connection with ritual sacrifice. Whether Lindo Man was sacrificed, whether he was a criminal executed, whether his death had ritual significance or was entirely pragmatic, is still debated. But the fact of his preservation, the fact that his face is visible to us 2,000 years after his death, the fact that we can study his last meal and his fingernails and the calluses on his hands, creates an encounter that is hard to categorize. It is archaeological, it is also intensely personal. This was a person. He had a morning on which he died. He had a face that people recognized. The bogs gave him back. Britain is full of these returns. The sea giving back the footprints of Happisburgh, the peat giving back the sweet track and the jade axe, the river giving back the bronze shields, the soil giving back the post holes of vanished houses and the shadows of long-filled ditches. The material of this island has been particularly good at holding things. The clay soils of the Midlands, the chalk of the Downs, the peat of the uplands, the silt of the river valleys, all of them preserve evidence of the past with unusual faithfulness, and the people who study that evidence have become increasingly skilled at reading it. Ground-penetrating radar can reveal buried structures without a spade being put in the ground. LIDAR, airborne laser scanning, that can strip away vegetation to reveal the shape of the terrain beneath, has transformed understanding of the extent and complexity of ancient landscapes. Ancient DNA, extracted from teeth and bones, tells us about ancestry and health and diet and movement. We know more about the prehistoric peoples of Britain than was imaginable a generation ago. And every year, the picture becomes more detailed, more complex, more human. They were people. That is the essential fact. They were people who came to this island, or who were born here to parents who had come, or who had always been here as far as living memory went. They built things and grew things and made things and loved people, and buried their dead and left marks in the landscape. They were frightened of the dark, and comforted by fire, and moved by music. If the bone flutes found in some Neolithic contexts are any guide, they were us, in all the ways that matter, and we are them, in the same ways. The conversation continues tonight, somewhere in Britain. Archaeologists are in the field, or in the laboratory, or at their desks. Someone is reading the results of an isotope analysis that will tell them whether a person found in a Bronze Age barrow grew up locally or traveled from far away. Someone is analyzing ancient DNA extracted from a Mesolithic skeleton found in a cave, trying to understand the genetic relationship between the first farmers and the hunter-gatherers who've preceded them. Someone is running a layer survey of a hillside in Wales and discovering in the pattern of shadows that the laser reveals the outlines of a Bronze Age field system that no one knew was there. The conversation between the present and the past, that is, archaeology, is one of the most remarkable intellectual activities of our time. It is slow, painstaking, and often inconclusive, but it is also capable, occasionally, of revelations that rewrite everything we thought we knew. Lore. The footprints at Happisburgh, discovered in 2013 and destroyed by the tide within a fortnight, rewrote the history of human presence in Britain at a stroke. The ancient DNA studies of the past decade have revolutionized our understanding of prehistoric population movements. The discovery that Stonehenge's blue stones may have been carried from a dismantled Welsh monument has opened entirely new ways of thinking about the monument's meaning. The story is not finished. It will never be finished. Every generation discovers something that the previous generation missed or misunderstood, and every generation will in turn be superseded by the next. This is not a weakness of the discipline. It is its great strength. The past is not fixed. It is a living question that we carry with us, and the asking of it tells us as much about ourselves as about those who came before. As the night settles, let the darkness settle around you now. Let the weight of the day lift from your shoulders and your mind. Think for a moment of the island that lies around you, the chalk downs in the south, white beneath their thin layer of soil, the clay vales of the Midlands, where the rivers run slow and brown, the granite moors of the west, swept by Atlantic weather, their surfaces dotted with the standing stones and ruined farmsteads of a dozen different periods. The mountains of Wales rising sharp and old from the surrounding lowlands, the long spine of the Pennines running north through the heart of England, the highlands of Scotland, ancient rocks scraped bare by ice, their locks dark and cold, all of it old, all of it occupied, all of it marked by every generation that has lived here. Beneath the field you walked across today, the remains of 3 earlier field systems lie one above the other, each one the work of a different community in a different time. Beneath the road you drove down, the line of a Roman surveyor still determines the direction. Beneath the hill that looks so natural in the distance, the earthworks of an Iron Age enclosure give it its characteristic shape. You are surrounded by depth, by time made material. The Neolithic farmers who built the long barrows looked up at the same hills. You see the Bronze Age herders who drove their cattle along the ancient ridgeways looked at the same horizon. The Iron Age warriors who manned the ramparts of their hill forts heard the same wind in the grass. On an October afternoon, different languages, different clothes, different names for the hills and rivers, different understandings of why the sun rises and what happens after death. But the same hills, the same sky, the same island. In the long view, the view from the top of deep time, we are not separated from all those who came before us. We are continuous with them. We are the latest layer in a landscape that has been inhabited and loved and worked and quarreled over and preyed upon for 900,000 years. 900,000 years of human presence. 900,000 years of fires lit against the dark. 900,000 years of children sleeping, and mothers watching, and old people telling stories about the ones who came before. You are part of that long story. Your sleep tonight is part of that long story. Let the stones stand in the dark, and let the barrows hold their silence. Let the rivers run to their ancient seas. You are held by history. You are held by the island that has held so many. You are safe in the long continuity of human presence on this particular piece of the earth. The rain is coming in from the west. It always does. It will fall on the chalk and the granite and the peat and the clay. It will fall on the old stones and the new roads and the churchyard use and the ancient trackways. It will soak into the ground and find its way through layers of sediment that remember every era, down to the water table, and then out through the springs that have always been sacred. The same rain that fell on Dogland, the same rain that fell on the builders of Avery, the same rain that fell on the Roman soldiers huddled against the wall at Vindelander, are writing their letters home in the lamplight. The same rain falling on you now in the long, unbroken chain of nights on this island. Sleep one last thing before sleep. There is a sound that belongs to Britain. It is not a dramatic sound. It is the sound of wind moving through long grass on an exposed hillside. The specific quality of it depends on the season and the direction of the wind and the kind of thin grass. But there is a signature to it that you recognize once you have heard it. A high, continuous movement through the stems with lower notes underneath, where the wind finds. The hollows and the old earthworks stand anywhere on the chalk downland in the late afternoon, on the ridge above Avery, or on the high ground near the ridgeway, or on the smooth curves of the South Downs. And that sound is what you hear, and the wind through the grass, the enormous unhurried sky, the landscape that absorbs time without being changed by it. The people who built the monuments of the British Neolithic heard that sound. It was the ambient sound of their working day, the background to the carrying and placing of stones, the constant companion of their ceremonial gatherings. It is one of the things they would recognize if they could somehow return to the landscape they shaped. The wind through the long grass on the chalk. That sound has been continuous since the last ice age. It was there before the first monument was built, and it will be there after the last one has eroded back into the earth. It is in some sense the sound of the island itself, the sound of the deep geological fact of these particular hills under this particular sky. And let it be with you tonight as you sleep. The long grass, the wind, the unhurried continuity of a landscape that has held more lives than anyone could count. You are one of them. One more life on this island. One more night. Sleep well.